Okay, so you want to own a gambling den. You picture candlelight on green baize, the click of ivory dice, gentlemen in silk waistcoats pushing stacks of gold across a table while you stand by the door, collecting nothing but admiration. Then you open one surviving account book. A single night's play at a fashionable London gaming house in the early 1800s could see more money change hands across one table than a skilled tradesman would earn in 10 years of honest work. And almost none of it on a bad night belonged to the house. That's the part the romantic version leaves out. Someone has to buy the candles, pay the men who watch the door, cover the chair a client smashed in a rage, replace the dice a loser accused of being loaded, and find the rent when the fashionable crowd decides your rooms are no longer the place to be seen losing money. We're going behind the baize and into the ledgers. We'll open a large London gaming house around 1820, follow the coins in and out, and see whether the owner could actually get rich. First, the name is slightly wrong, and it matters. We call these places gambling dens because that's the word that survived into legend, all smoke and menace. In practice, in Georgian and Regency London, you're not opening one kind of business. At the top sat the great subscription clubs of St. James's, White's, Brooks's, and later Crockford's, gentlemen's establishments with candlelit dining rooms, liveried staff, and gambling folded quietly into an atmosphere of respectability. Below that sat the hells, dozens of them clustered around the same few streets, rooms rented above shops and taverns where anyone with coin in his pocket could sit down to hazard or faro. Contemporary writers counted scores of these houses operating in the West End at once, some lasting years, most lasting months. Your place sits somewhere in between, ambitious enough to draw real money, disreputable enough that the law technically wants you closed. A restaurant, a private members club, a moneylender's office, and a casino, all operating out of one address, all pretending to be merely a gentleman's supper club that happens to keep cards in the drawer. The location does most of the heavy lifting. St. James's, in the shadow of the palace, and the clubs of the aristocracy put you within a 5-minute walk of the men with the largest incomes in the country and the least practical experience managing money. They arrive with different needs, all of them expensive. One wants supper before he plays. Another wants a private room so his losses stay quiet. A third wants credit because his allowance from his father won't arrive until quarter day, and he is not going to let that stop him. The building is arranged to turn each of those needs into a charge, or better, into a debt. The supper room sells the meal. The card room sells the play itself. Through the house's cut, the private rooms sell discretion, and upstairs, in a drawer that never quite gets mentioned in polite conversation, sits the paper that turns a young man's bad night into your long-term investment. Before a single candle is lit, though, someone has to fit the place out, and fitting it out for this crowd was not cheap. A subscription club of any standing needed a kitchen capable of a proper supper at 3 in the morning, wine cellars stocked to a standard that would not embarrass a duke, card rooms furnished well enough that losing a fortune in them felt, if not pleasant, at least dignified. Real fitted-out gaming establishments of the period ran to many thousands of pounds in furnishing and stock before a single hand was dealt, sums that would take a skilled craftsman decades of ordinary wages to match. Compare that against a laborer's day. A working man in London at this time might earn a couple of shillings for a full day's labor. There are 20 shillings to the pound. Do the arithmetic on a fitting-out bill running into the thousands, and you're already talking about many decades of an ordinary man's working life poured into curtains, mahogany tables, silver plate, and a wine cellar before you have collected a single subscription. And the fixtures are only the shell. You need the equipment of the trade itself, and it is not cheap equipment. Faro banks, dice, dedicated hazard tables built to a house specification, candles enough to keep every room bright until dawn, because darkness is bad for business and worse for catching a cheat. You need chandeliers because the wealthy do not gamble by tallow light if they can help it, and good wax candles were themselves a serious running cost, burning through the night, every night, whether the tables were full or empty. Add the wine, the delicacies for the supper room, the linen, the coal for the fires in every room you intend to keep occupied until sunrise, and you still haven't opened the doors. Meet your staff, because a house like this does not run on one cheerful proprietor and a pack of cards. You need a cook and kitchen staff to keep supper flowing at any hour a member might demand it. You need waiters, footmen, and a porter at the door whose entire job is deciding on site who is permitted to enter and who is quietly turned away, because your reputation is worth more than any single guest's money. You need a croupier, the dealer who runs the bank at faro or presides over hazard, a role requiring nerves, arithmetic, and an unshakable poker face, since his errors, honest or otherwise, come directly out of your pocket. You need at least one man whose sole function is watching for cheats, because a fashionable gaming house that gets a reputation for crooked dice or a marked deck is a fashionable gaming house that closes within the season. And you need, eventually, a moneylender working the rooms, sometimes you yourself, sometimes an associate, ready to advance a young heir enough to keep playing once his pockets are empty, at rates that would make a modern loan shark blush. None of that touches your biggest and strangest cost, the bank itself. In games like faro and hazard, the house does not merely rent out tables, it plays, it stands as the bank against every player at once, which means on any given night the house can lose, and lose badly, to a run of luck or a well-heeled gentleman with nerve. You need capital sitting in reserve for exactly that purpose. A war chest large enough to cover a catastrophic evening without the bank breaking in front of a room full of witnesses, because nothing empties a gaming house faster than the rumor that its bank cannot pay. Now think about what all of this actually is. It is not entertainment. It is not hospitality. Look again at that account book, the fortunes changing hands over a single table in a single night. That is not gentlemen enjoying an evening of cards. That is money being extracted from the richest and least disciplined young men in England, one hand of faro at a time, and every candle, every joint of meat, every glass of claret in the building exists purely to keep them at the table long enough for the odds to do their work. A gaming house was never in the business of selling entertainment. It was in the business of selling just enough comfort and credit that a wealthy man would stay seated until mathematics finished the job. It takes most proprietors years to understand that the supper, the wine, and the flattery are not the amenities. They are the machine. So, where does the money actually come from? Because the naive answer that you simply win at cards is the least reliable income in the building. Start with the most respectable stream, which is also the most boring, the subscription. The great clubs charged an annual fee simply for the privilege of walking through the door, alongside an entrance fee when a new member was elected, since membership itself was scarce by design. A club that let anyone in was worth belonging to for nobody. Blackballing one anonymous vote against a candidate sinking his membership outright was not petty cruelty. It was inventory control. Scarcity is what let you charge a fortune for entry to a room that, physically, was just tables and chairs. Second stream, the house's cut on play itself. At games like faro, the bank held a built-in mathematical edge over the punters, small on any single card but compounding relentlessly across a night of hundreds of hands. You did not need to cheat. You barely needed luck. You needed volume, the same wealthy men returning night after night, handing their money across the table in small installments that added up to their entire fortunes over a season. The house's advantage was never dramatic on any one hand. It was patient, and patience is what turns a 5% edge into somebody's inheritance. Third stream, and arguably the most reliable one of all, supper and wine. Every fashionable gaming house doubled as a restaurant, and the markup on food and drink served to men who had just lost or just won a fortune and had no interest in haggling over the price of claret was substantial. A man 300 pounds down at hazard is not counting shillings on the wine bill. He is trying to forget the 300 pounds. Fourth stream, and the one the moralists of the day wrote entire pamphlets about, money lending. Once a young gentleman's cash ran out, his credit did not have to. The house, or a lender working in close partnership with it, would advance funds against his expectations, his inheritance, his father's estate, at interest rates that made the original losses look like a rounding error by comparison. This is the stream that turned a bad night at the tables into a bad decade, and it is also the stream most likely to eventually pay for the mahogany paneling. The debt collector waiting outside a young heir's door the following morning was, quietly, part of your business model. Add the streams together: subscriptions, the house edge, supper and wine, and the money lending that followed a loser home. Suddenly, whether you actually win at the tables on any given night is almost beside the point. But here is where it gets interesting, because the smartest proprietors in London found a way to make the riskiest part of the business, the bank itself, someone else's problem. This is the mechanism, and it is the same one that shows up in every version of this story you will ever examine. At many houses, wealthy backers or syndicates of established gamblers would supply the capital for the bank, taking a share of the winnings in return, while the proprietor supplied the rooms, the staff, the reputation, and the crowd. The proprietor's income arrived steadily, from subscriptions and supper and rent on the tables, while the wilder swings of actually playing the bank against the house's own money sat with someone else's capital. Translate that out of the period's language. The building owner sold the risk and kept the crowd. It is the exact structure you'd recognize from a modern casino leasing floor space to an independent card room operator, except carved into the arrangement of a St. James's Club 2 centuries earlier. Which raises the obvious question: if you're the one supplying the bank and carrying that risk, why not simply shorten the odds and take a bigger cut? The wall you'd hit was reputational, not mathematical. A house known to be rigged emptied overnight because word traveled through society faster than any newspaper, and a gentleman's willingness to lose gracefully depended entirely on believing the game was honest. Fair odds, or at least odds fair enough to survive scrutiny, were the price of admission to the only market that mattered. So by now the model looks solved. Charge for entry, take a mathematical edge on the play, mark up the supper, and lend to the losers on the way out. It's elegant, it's durable. Now here is what breaks it. The first threat lives at the table itself, and it never forgives. A single catastrophic night. The mathematics of a house edge work beautifully across thousands of hands, and fail spectacularly across one unlucky one. A determined gentleman with deep pockets and no fear of ruin could sit down against your bank and simply keep playing until either his fortune or yours gave out first. Houses without sufficient reserve capital could be broken in a single evening by exactly this kind of player, the bank unable to cover its obligations, the proprietor's reputation destroyed in the time it took the story to reach the next club over. The second threat is legal, and it never stopped hanging over the whole enterprise. Gaming of this kind existed in a permanent gray zone. Specific games were periodically outlawed by name, forcing proprietors to simply switch which dice game was on the table that season, and raids on the less respectable hells were a routine hazard of the trade, closing houses overnight and scattering their capital and clientele. The grand subscription clubs bought themselves a measure of protection through respectability and membership, but the hells beneath them lived one unlucky magistrate away from ruin. The third threat is the debt itself, curdling. Money lending to the wealthy sounds like the safest business in the building until you remember that inheritances take time to arrive. Fathers occasionally disinherit disgraced sons, and a debtor who cannot pay is worth considerably less to you than his paper suggested. Bad debts piled up quietly in ledgers, the same way bad harvests piled up in a farmer's accounts, and a house too generous with credit could find itself rich on paper and unable to buy tomorrow's candles. The fourth threat is fashion itself, and it is the cruelest one because it cannot be managed at all. These houses lived and died by being the place to be seen. A club that fell out of favor with the right dukes and second sons did not fail gradually. It simply emptied, its rooms as divinely appointed as ever, its tables as honest as ever, its subscription list evaporating to a rival across the square that had simply become more fashionable that season. You could control the odds. You could not control taste. So, knowing all of it, the fitting out costs, the bank's exposure, the legal risk, the bad debts, the fickleness of fashion, was this ever a good business? Time to open the ledger. No complete account book survives for any single house that we can walk through hand by hand, so what follows is a reconstruction built from the documented costs and revenues of the period, not a lost casino spreadsheet. In a strong season, your subscriptions and entrance fees from a full membership bring in a comfortable sum on their own. The house edge across a winter of nightly play, assuming reasonable volume and no catastrophic single loss, adds considerably more. Patient rather than dramatic. Supper and wine, sold at a serious markup to men in no state to negotiate, add a steady third stream, and the interest quietly accruing on the paper in the upstairs drawer, assuming most of your debtors eventually pay, is where the real long-run fortune sits. Set against that, staff wages running through the year regardless of how full the tables are, candles and coal burning nightly, whether anyone plays or not, the wine cellar and kitchen restocked constantly, the reserve capital for the bank sitting idle until the one night you need every penny of it, and the bad debts you write off every season from gentlemen whose fathers turned out less generous than hoped. In a good year, the surplus is substantial, the kind of money that buys land, buys respectability, buys entry into precisely the class of society your clientele already belonged to. In a bad year, it is a different story entirely. Fashion shifts 2 doors down. A wealthy player breaks your bank in one legendary evening that becomes the talk of every club in London for entirely the wrong reasons. The magistrates take an interest. Half your debtors' fathers refuse to honor their sons' obligations. The costs, the staff, the candles, the wine cellar, the coal, do not fall by half just because the crowd has. Same rooms, same green baize, same silver plate. One version of this story gets you a country estate. The other gets you a ruined reputation and a room full of furniture nobody in London wants to be seen buying. And history is very clear about which proprietors ended up in which chair. The winner, the one worth remembering by name, is William Crockford. He began his working life as a fishmonger's son, about as far from the aristocracy as a Regency Englishman could start. He built his fortune not primarily by dealing cards himself, but by mastering exactly the structure we've just walked through, understanding the house edge better than the men playing against it, managing his bank's capital with a discipline his aristocratic clientele never bothered to apply to their own money, and eventually opening Crockford's Club, the most famous gaming house of its era on St. James's Street itself. He is remembered as one of the wealthiest self-made men in England by the time of his death. A fishmonger's son who ended up, through cards and patience and mathematics, richer than most of the lords who lost fortunes at his tables. He did not get rich by having better luck than his guests. He got rich by owning the house that outlasted everyone's luck. The losers were the young men on the other side of the baize, the heirs and second sons who mistook one good night for a pattern, who signed papers in the small hours that their fathers would spend years untangling, who believed, the way every gambler eventually does, that the run of bad luck was nearly over. Some of their names survive too, in diaries and letters and the occasional newspaper account of an estate sold off to cover debts run up at the tables. Their story never changes shape. It is the same story, told over and over, in every account of the period. So, the verdict on the title question: could you get rich owning a gambling den? Yes, if you understood you were running a bank with a mathematical edge and a money-lending office attached, dressed up as a supper club. No, if you believed the gambling itself, the dice and the cards and the thrill of a single hand, was the business. That part was barely a business at all. It was the bait. The fortune was in the edge, in the interest, in the markup on the wine, in every small, unglamorous certainty stacked around one uncertain game. Go back one last time to that account book, the fortunes changing hands over a single table in a single night, every candle burning past midnight, every plate of supper served at 3 a.m, every friendly word from a footman who remembered a gentleman's name and his usual claret was not hospitality, it was patience, dressed as comfort, waiting for the mathematics to finish. Spanish, you never got rich at the card table, you got rich owning the room the card table sat in. The whole of fashionable London walked through your door, believing they were playing a game of chance. What they were actually doing was funding a very old, very reliable business, one hand at a time.